Right, well, we'll get started then. So, good afternoon. My name is Blóithín Hurley, and welcome from the Local Studies Department in Waterford Library Services. And we're delighted to have so many of you here today. We're also delighted to have two wonderful speakers, and we're going to be looking at the history of the links between Ireland and Wales. And just before I get started, I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping just to let everybody know. And the first thing is that we are recording today's talks. So just be aware of that. So if you don't want to be if you're aware of that, if you don't want anybody to know your questions or whatever, if you just put them into the Q&A rather than the chat. But if you are quite happy for everybody to see what you've got to say, or you've got any comments or whatever to make, you can put those into chat. Now, I'm sure most of you are very comfortable with Zoom, but just in case you have forgotten or you don't know how to do that, if you just wiggle your mouse around, you'll see there's a little black bar will pop up at the bottom of your screen, and there's a Q&A and a chat option there. So just remember, the chat will go to everybody. Everybody will see what goes into the chat, but the Q&A just goes to the participants. So we'll get on to what we have today. So we have two wonderful speakers lined up. We have Professor Claire Connolly and we have Dr. James Louis Smith, and they're both involved in the Ports Past and Present project. Now, that project, as I said, it looks at that shared British and Irish imagination regarding the Irish Sea and its place in that imagination. So just to let you know what they have to say about it themselves, they're telling us that the Irish Sea has a singular and resonant place in a shared British and Irish imagination, and the simple question of its power both to connect and to divide has commanded political and cultural attention for centuries. To consider sea crossings in Irish culture is to encounter both certainty, enduring environmental realities experienced over centuries, and unpredictability as weather events set plans awry and make haphazard work of history. And we're all well aware of what the weather is like here in Ireland. Ports Past and Present, funded by the European Regional Development Fund via the Ireland-Wales Cooperation Programme, revisits the cultural heritage of these crossings and finds new ways of telling Irish sea stories. The project curates stories from coastal communities and port towns through a series of multimedia narratives captured on its website, in a heritage app, and through a series of creative works and films. And the project's focus is on the currently functioning ports in the Irish Sea basin. That's Rosslare, Dublin, Holyhead, Fishguard, and Pembroke Dock. And the first of our speakers today is Professor Claire Connolly. And Claire is the project lead for Ports Past and Present itself. She is Professor of Modern English at University College Cork, Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. She teaches and researches Irish literature and is currently writing a book on Irish romanticism for Cambridge University Press. And the title of her talk is Irish Sea Crossings. So if you'd like to take that there, Claire, we'd be delighted to hear what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Blóithín. That's great. I'm sharing my screen there. Does that look okay?
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks very much.
Great. I thought I'd start us on the water. So yeah, we wanted to be clear about the currently functioning ports, the ports that carry ferry passenger traffic through them at the moment, because of course we know we're speaking. Thank you very much to Waterford Libraries and the local history programme for having us. So we'll explain a little bit more about our kind of broader project to make up for the exclusion of Waterford. I might just mention that I went to school in Dungarvan and hope that helps me along the way here. So as Blóithín said in her very kind introduction, our project Ports Past and Present, funded by the European Regional Development Fund through the Ireland-Wales Cooperation Programme, is thinking about these connections back and forth across the sea. You might notice them up there in our logo. Sometimes the map there and the logo takes a little bit of refocusing, and you have to remember, are you looking at sea or land? What are the kind of shapes you're looking at here? And so part of our project is to sort of orient ourselves to the sea. And Even though we're an island in Ireland, sometimes we've been accused of a kind of a certain sea blindness, or not necessarily thinking about the kind of significant role of the sea in our culture and our history. So that's the perspective, if you like, looking out across from those crossings that have made and shaped Irish history. I thought I might just start with this poem. It's a translation of an old Irish poem. Some of you might know it, sometimes translated as the Viking Terror. This translation is by Seamus Heaney, and it appeared on one of Seamus Heaney's famous Christmas cards. He would have a Christmas card made up every year with a short one of his own poems, and this went out one year. And this is how Heaney translated the Viking Terror. Wind fierce tonight, mane of the sea whipped white. I am not afraid. No ravening Norse on course through quiet waters. There's a Frank O'Connor translation of the poem as well, where he says, I need not fear the hordes of hell coursing the Irish Channel. So I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. It's a monk safe indoors, thinking that at least I don't have to worry about the seaborne Viking attacks tonight because the sea is too rough. And it's that, as Blóithín said in the introduction to us, it's that sense of those kind of enduring environmental realities, the prevailing southwesterly winds that blow across open waters, across the Irish Sea, this persistent and strong tidal currents that are whipped up by the winds, meaning that unusually steep waves break in high water. It's a characteristic of the Irish Sea. And all the sandbanks along the east coast, especially between Dublin and Wexford, which throughout history have led to the wreck of many ships. And of course, climate change means many of these conditions are currently worsening because there are more frequent storms. And I'm sure some of you listening might have your own Irish Sea memories or stories of weather delays or weather experiences on the Irish Sea. And going back to some of the kind of earliest environmental writing about Ireland, this has been noted about Ireland. So this is Gerard Bote's A Natural History of Ireland. Bote was a physician who came over to Ireland with Cromwell. He was a physician in Cromwell's army, and he began the first sort of Anglophone cataloguing of aspects of the Irish natural history, Irish environments, and so on. And one of the things he said was that the Irish Sea, he says, has both been defamed by ancient and modern writers in regard of its boisterousness and tempestuousness. And Bote is actually trying to say it's not that bad at all, really. The sea isn't as rough as you'd think. And of course, he's arguing against the weather in the service of a kind of an Anglicizing agenda that came with Cromwell to say that Ireland could naturally be connected to Britain, whereas later generations of cultural nationalists, the writers of The Nation, for example, were often very keen to talk about the fierce waves breaking in the high waters and the sense of natural divisions between Britain and Ireland. And there's a kind of remarkably rich literature and culture of that, of making those comparisons, going right back here, as I say, to Bote. And though it's not just a body of water that divides and connects Britain and Ireland, but also a whole kind of infrastructure surrounding that body of water, ports, harbours, roads, railways, all growing and being improved from the 18th century forwards. And of course, we're currently seeing a whole new infrastructure as well, with new customs checks being put in Dublin and Rosslare, the whole kind of infrastructure that is to support the so-called border in the Irish Sea that Brexit has wrought upon us. James and I have a colleague, Jonathan Evershed, who's more expert on the contemporary side of this than we are, but we can all see the kind of the links and continuities and the spreading outwards of the road network from the east into Ireland. and often visualized as in this 18th century map in the form of the strip map, where the road, you're invited to see the road as it moves on this vertical axis up and down through very kind of distinctive topography. This is the road through North Wales onto Anglesey and into Holyhead. The technology obviously made a huge difference in relation to Irish Sea crossings and Irish Sea stories and port history. I mentioned that kind of the growth of infrastructure around and about the ports, especially some of which grew in particular ways at particular times, or their fates moved with politics and also with climate, as estuaries became silted up, for example, and so on. This is a painting of the journey that George IV took to Dublin when he visited Dublin in 1821. And it kind of captures a moment in this transport history, this travel history, because George IV had intended to travel to Ireland on his royal yacht, but was unable to because of bad weather. And so he transitioned onto one of the steamboats, which are carrying the mail back and forth. And it was one of the mail boats were absolutely in their very early days, in their infancy in these years. But you can see the painting makes a kind of a drama of that simple change of transport, where you have the steamship over to the side of the painting shown in dark with its billowing its billowing kind of body almost kind of receding into that darkness. Meanwhile, the new steamship sits kind of flat and squat on, as if kind of already calming the water. So it's kind of making purposeful history out of wind and weather. And that visit of George IV then was marked by kind of new building on both sides of the Irish Sea, a kind of a triumphal arch in Holyhead, and this pillar built in Dunleary, which I think it's Thackeray described it as a massive pillar set on 4 fat balls, a sort of not a bad representation of the monarch whom it commemorates. Thackeray said something nasty like that about it. And in some of our coastal communities and in port towns, we have the kind of the heritage and the memory of these crossings preserved in different ways. The tiny footsteps of George IV in Howth here, for instance. But also we have everywhere around us a sense, as we kind of walk along piers and harbours and sea walls, we kind of live with that history as well, and we see the changes that it has made. These are just a few examples from Dublin that help us kind of understand how we can look back to some earlier cultural representations to see how these changes came to be. So this is a view of Dublin Bay from Clontarf, that's an early one from the 1790s, that's capturing how much of Dublin was being reclaimed at this period, how much sea land was turning into land for development, what's been described as Dublin's swivel to the east. Its kind of whole move to the east was happening at this stage, and Dublin almost as a kind of a polder landscape, a landscape of reclaimed land, with and the sea very much part of that, the bay taken in as a good kind of background to Dublin's development and central to the development. Or this painting where you can see the erection of walls to protect against to protect these newly reclaimed lands against the force of the sea and its the waves that are always present. And this my particular favorite, this beautiful painting by James Arthur O'Connor of Sandymount, which captures a kind of an almost romantic sensibility, where the kind of the waves are sort of in a delicate evolving relationship with the landscape, and there's figures at rest, at play, walking, the harbour wall out to the edge of the painting, and the sea and the ships, the topmasts of the ships just behind it. And so what we're doing in our project, Ports Past and Present, is we're trying to kind of catch and track and trace lots of representations like this that help us think through this evolving relationship across the ports, the Welsh and the Irish ports in particular, that we're looking at. And we're doing it through, at the moment, in a number of kind of different ways, but a central aspect of the project that James and I are particularly involved with is we're sort of retelling heritage stories about the ports. This is just an example from Dublin, about the Dublin Time Bowl and the kind of the stories around that, or a more sensational one from Pembroke Dock, which is about the building of the Millennium Falcon in one of the hangars in Pembroke Dock. I never thought I'd be involved in a project that had anything to do with Star Wars, but there you go. That's where we are. So we're gathering and sharing those stories. We're very open to hearing more, and James can tell you a bit more about the sort of technology that underlies all of that in our wider projects. We're also working with specially commissioned creative artists, creative practitioners, writers, painters, and so on. And if you follow us on Twitter, which we'd be delighted if you did do, we're Ports Past Pres. You can see some of those stories, and they capture natural heritage as well as built heritage and literary heritage and other aspects of cultural heritage. We're also on Instagram, and we have a podcast called Port Stories. And our very latest activities, we're involved in a series of online, sadly, we wish they weren't, but like us all here, we're all living online, Port Fest. So we've had a Dublin Port Fest and a Rosslare Port Fest, and there'll soon be a Fishguard Port Fest. So with that, I might hand you over to James. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. So now that we've had a thematic introduction, I think what I'm going to do just spend a little bit of time with a bit of a show and tell on our website. So Claire showed you a couple of the examples of what our stories look like, but what I'll do is I'll show you a bit of the map, and we can drill in a little bit more detail. So this is our website. So basically, you can see here, we have all of our project information. You can see our social media links, that kind of thing. But we also have, as part of this, a story collection, and increasingly we have creative material, sort of long creative pieces of writing interspersed with artwork, sort of an exegesis of a discussion of creative work, but also these stories. So what I might do is my favorite thing, which is go to full screen on our map. So basically, at the moment, we just reached a milestone with this collection because we have 70 stories. And although we don't have a sort of firm maximum in mind, we think maybe, I think we'll probably get up to a couple of hundred in total. It's not a comprehensive collection. We're not trying to do a sort of comprehensive history from the Middle Ages to present of everything that's ever happened in all these ports. But what we're trying to do, I think what Claire said is sort of resonates. The idea of multiple stories, of telling sort of sets of stories, clusters of stories, trying to find different varieties of stories by different people with different priorities, with different senses of how things connect across the Irish Sea. So if we go in a bit, so this is our region that you saw on our logo. So we've got sort of, one interesting thing is that you may notice these aren't all 100% on the port. So, this is Holyhead here, Fishguard is down here, there, Rosslare, Dublin Port, and, Pembroke Dock down here. I hope you can see my mouse. I don't know actually, but in any case, you can see what I'm talking about. But there is actually more to the story than just the ports themselves, because we have been exploring the idea of the environs of a port, the idea that a port is not just say, just with Rosslare. It is not just the Europort, not just the village or town of Rosslare. And it's not even just the Wexford, that immediate area, Wexford town and Ladies Island, say that particular locale around the port. But the stories of ports are actually, where does a port stop? It goes inland, the supply chains. You know, Claire showed that picture of the toll roads to, you know, to Holyhead over the, you know, Menai Straits, for example, from London. That ports don't end. Ports follow trails of infrastructure, railway lines, roads, and shipping routes. You know, there's the kind of route that's from, say, the transatlantic route that passes through, you know, the St George's Channel and through the Irish Sea, going to, say, Liverpool or Holyhead, Pembroke Dock, Milford Haven, but also on to Cardiff, for example. You know, the birth of the cruise liner, you know, the Lusitania, the Mauretania, Cunard lines, often stopping in Fishguard, which in the early 20th century becomes a really popular destination. We're talking about this whole region and these kind of broader movements through it. But what I might do is just start off by showing you a little bit of what we've got in the sort of Waterford-Wexford area. So as you'll see, I mean, I would also include, you know, in terms of a vicinity, you'll notice that our stories, although they're not what they will be, they don't really stop, you know. So between Dublin and its sort of port stories, we've got, you know, Dunleary at Kingstown, as was, you know, and it keeps going, Wicklow Town, Arklow, you know, Tinnaburn, you know, like it keeps going all the way along, you know, the coast, and then it follows the kind of border. And as you can see, we even have a few stories around the sort of border, the harbour border between counties, Waterford and Wexford, you know. Some of these stories actually came from an interesting exercise we did where we facilitated a class assessment for some students in a master's in public history and family history at University of Limerick. And some of them chose to do, we weren't too prescriptive about where their stories could be, but some of them chose to do some very interesting stories, you know, about that sort of connect up to both counties, Waterford and Wexford, but also, you know, to Waterford as well. So an interesting one that I think I might just open that one up is this one, which essentially is about the story of Waterford Harbour's role in the stone that became the first Hiberno-Romanesque cathedral in Newfoundland, Canada. You know, there's that Irish link to Newfoundland, the strong Irish identity of the communities there. And this is the story of, you know, where did, you know, how did the material, so this is one of the images, it's not, of where the stone came from, the stories of where the granite, you know, came from, and where it ended up in Canada, you know, the sort of colonial networks of production and construction that, you know, facilitated this cathedral. So yeah, just a sec. Yeah, so basically that gives you an idea of one of our sort of more specific stories, but we've also, for example, got another one that another of the students did about the Waterford shipping disaster, about which I imagine you'd be more familiar with than I, of like a merchant ship sinking by U-boats during the First World War. And that connects to other stories we have in the collection about the sinking of the Leinster and for, you know, by U-boats as well. You know, there's this kind of network of commemoration that's very important to all the communities that were involved in the sort of U-boat, I suppose, you know, of attacks during the First World War and later in the Second World War. One of our colleagues, Rita, before her current role in Ports Past and Present, did a whole project about Welsh U-boats and the Irish Sea. So this is a story, like a lot of the stories what we like the most in the project, stories that link, you know, a local tragedy to a regional tragedy to a sort of a theme that runs through So if we look down, I suppose we might even find, you know, U-boats as a theme. We like to link our stories together, and you'll see, for example, we have quite a lot of U-boat related stories, you know, within the collection, and that's what we're aiming for. We're trying to encourage more of that, basically. Yeah, more sort of holistic stories. So basically, I think I might just go out of full screen because it's a bit hard to navigate back and forth in full screen. But basically, you start to see these interesting patterns emerging. Another interesting couple of stories we have here, another student story about the Hook Peninsula and Hook Lighthouse, you know, about the sort of the story of the lighthouse. You know, it's a popular tourist destination, but also has an interesting history, which once again links into another theme in the collection, because we have other lighthouse stories, you know. So if I were to go and look at some of our other lighthouse stories, we have, for example, you know, this one, Tusker Rock, you know, the lighthouse off which you can see. I mean, if you go in to the ferry route, you can see that Tusker Rock is just off the Rosslare to Pembroke Dock ferry route, and is very important. We have another story coming out about the Smalls Lighthouse, for example, tiny little islands in just off the coast of Pembrokeshire. And as you heard about the gannets, you know, the Grassholm Island, you know, the gannet tree, like there's these tiny little spits of rock. So whenever, and we also would like to have some salty island stories about bird migration as well, because so every time you tell a story, it connects to another place. The region sort of stitches together a bit more richly. Another story that is one story, but is very much indicative of a larger connection of like many sinkings, you know, due to bad weather. All along the coast, you know, the southern coast of Ireland, all the way from the shipping coming from the continent and from the Atlantic Ocean, heading through the Irish Sea to its various ports. And this is one that I found that was particularly interesting from the Alfred D Snow, which was extremely well remembered in both Waterford and Wexford in the folklore archive. I've done a series myself from Ducas, the folklore collection from the National Schools collection of the 1930s, of the early days of, you know, the Irish state, when this project to document the folklore of the nation was undertaken. And this is one little thing, and it's attested to in both Waterford and in Wexford, in the communities on both sides of the passage, you know, passage east, but also, you know, on the so if we look at Broomhill Point, which is where the ship eventually went down, the Alfred D Snow, you know, there's a lot of the stories of it come from both Dunmore East and also from Passage East. You know, like if you look at the townlands on either side of the harbour, like these stories are not, you know, county level stories, the stories of lifeboats. I mean, it was the lifeboats of both communities that tried to save the men of the Alfred D Snow, but it was a tremendous tragedy, and they mostly went down with the ship. And now there's poems and songs, folk songs. You know, it's become a really, you know, it's a big outsized incident that is just one of hundreds of similar incidences in. So whenever we, you know, so those are our examples that I could have this specifically from Waterford, but it's part of this kind of trail of stories that you follow along the coast, ballad singing that crosses the Irish Sea, Arklow, Ireland's first RNLI lifeboat station, you know, stories about, like, none of these stories, although they are extremely place specific, they're part of a regional story that works at a variety of scales, and it sort of stitches things together. You know, Wicklow town, Welsh settlers in Wicklow, follow it along, you know, go up to Dunleary, there's more stories, and they're like a patchwork, like a tapestry of stories, that the more stories we add, the richer it gets and the more interwoven it gets. So I'd reiterate what Claire said. if you have stories like that you think tie into a broader Wexford experience, a Welsh experience, that sort of tie the coasts of the two counties together and that region, we'd love to hear them, especially the things they have in common, you know, Norman settlement, you know, there's like so many things that you could consider to be shared stories. If you have stories like that, we're always looking for sort of slightly more unorthodox takes on what is part of the project. So we have like the majority clustered around the 5 ports, but we always have like a much more expansive sense of what a port's past and present are about and what the region consists of culturally and historically. So I think with that I'll stop, but I think sometimes it's, you know, with this kind of material, Q&A is often a good place to basically we have stories for all kinds of things. So if you have any questions, I often find I have a story that might help to support, you know, talking about that particular point. I apologize if you can hear my daughter in the background. I think she's having a not great afternoon. So thanks for bearing with me, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Claire. They were both fascinating talks. Now, if anybody has any questions, you can put them into the Q&A, or you can put them into the chat, or if you've anything else. I just have one question there. It was fascinating hearing about those talks or those stories, James. And I was just wondering, can anybody access that website that you were showing where you can see the different stories that are attached? And maybe you could tell us what the website address is, so we could pop it into the chat or something for people.
No probs. I'll drop it in now into the chat. It's portspastpresent.eu. We also have, which might be of interest to people, quite a lot of tours, which are essentially, you know, sequential collections. And that's the link for the tours, but you might find they're like groupings of different themes, and we're always working on that. So that's another way of engaging with the content. And then as was mentioned, there's an app coming. There'll be even more types of ways of engaging with the material in the future.
And we release a new story every Friday on Twitter. So
brilliant. And if somebody goes into that Ports Past Present site that you just gave, they'll be able to contact you there if they have a story, or if they know of a family member that would have something.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant.
Our email is just ports@ucc.ie, so we're easy to find usually.
Ports@ucc. I will put that in there now for everybody, so that everybody can see it. So ports@ucc.ie.
Thanks,
Chloe. Great. No problem. Everybody has that. Now, can I just ask you a question, if you don't mind? I suppose I'm an art historian by training. That's where I started out, and I suppose I'm very visual. So you had lots of wonderful images there, but I was particularly struck by that strip map that you had. How common are those? I've never come across one of those before.
I think they're relatively common. I think from sort of about the 1780s maybe or something to around 1800. The Irish example is a Taylor and Skinner's Book of Irish Road Maps. I think Book of Irish Roads. I forget what it's called, but I think it's on askireland.com. Actually, you can find it there. I'll check in a sec, but so that shows you, and they're not as filled in, some of the Irish ones with all, you know, did you see there's incredible topographical detail, and you know, they're showing you the changing landscape and everything. But I suppose it was a way of visualizing it, you know, it'll encourage you to visualize travel as very much on a very particular route, following the route of the mail coach or whatever, and allowed you to sort of understand the landscape you were passing through.
And did you just fold them up and then you opened it bit by bit as you went along, or what?
I think I've only ever seen them in books, like at the beginning of a travel. You might even see mine. My picture was like folded off from a page. Yeah.
They're actually also part of an older tradition of first the itinerary maps. So there's a good example of routes, you know, pilgrimage routes. So I'll just drop something in the chat. Matthew Paris's itinerary map is a good example of a linear itinerary map. But also Portolan charts, so navigation, where an entire coast and all of its locations is mapped out. And they're not attempting to accurately represent space. They're simply showing you where you to sail along the coast in X place. These are the features and ports and whatever you would encounter in sequence. And that's the same for the map that Claire was showing.
That's very useful. Yeah. Thanks. And the other question I had really too, Claire, was about you started off with that lovely poem, and I think everybody, like you say, has held has come across some version of that about the monk holed up and listening to the wind and saying, make himself feel safe. Does the sea, or do images like that show up a lot in Irish literature, and likewise in Welsh literature? And are there differences? Are there themes of centrality between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bláithín. I think they sort of turn up in unexpected places. I think they're there everywhere once you start looking for them. But you know, when I start with that picture of sort of the perspective from the middle of the sea, I think you have to sort of change your point of view, I guess, to find them. I mean, one of the great Irish sea poems, if you think about it, is Milton's Lycidas. I learned that when I was at school. I don't know if anybody else did, where, you know, it starts with Milton lamenting the loss of a learned friend who died just off Anglesey. And so he says he's in, you know, the Druids are looking after him. He's in the deep there. So, but you don't think of Milton as an Irish sea writer or anything like that. But so I suppose the connections are very much there, and they may shift and change with the transport. So some of the earlier writers, like the 19th century writers, such as Maria Edgeworth or Lady Morgan, they often treat sea crossings very matter-of-factly. You know, they expect characters are shuttling back and forth, and they don't even stop to write about the weather or anything like that. Lady Morgan, for example, claimed she was born on the Irish Sea. She liked to sort of story she told about her identity, you know. But then as transport improves, the transport links become part of the story. So Trollope's novels, for instance, or into the early and middle 20th century of Edna O'Brien at the end of The Country Girls. She's Kate and Baba standing on the ship wondering what their life will be like when they go to England. So I think it's there, but maybe you have to kind of shift your perspective a bit to see it. And yeah, I just see James putting in the chat there. There's a great story on the site about Mary Delaney, the 18th century Irish writer, and her travels. Yeah, she makes very light of the crossing. She says, you know, it's a matter of a mere 40 hours. You're hardly sick at all. Don't worry about it.
Isn't the author of that story, and she's giving a talk soon, right? That people might be interested.
At the Cork Harbour Festival in June. Yeah, and O'Nagle Place in Cork are organising it. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lovely image too that the 19th century Cork artist Daniel McLeish did. It's a sketch of him on, I think it's the Bristol, or he's on the way to Bristol. I can't remember the name. I think the boat is the Bristol.
I actually thought I had it in my images, but I didn't seem to.
Yeah, so, it's when he's going over to be a student, and it's in the late 1820s, and like that, it gives you a lovely image of what life was like, because you have some people and they're just sitting there, they're carrying on like as if they're on a bus. And you have other people, and they're obviously feeling the worst for wear. And it is just this lovely image of capturing what the
as you say, like. Hunched over the side. It's a fantastic image. Yeah.
Well, that's really good. Just seeing I have some stuff come in. Somebody has just come in here now, and they're saying that they just want to draw attention to Andrew Doherty's Waterford's Tide and Tales, in case the panel haven't yet come across his work.
No, we have
Fonts of knowledge. I have to say I've been following his work as well. It is, he captures a lot of things. But thank you very much, Alison, for sending that on to us. There was something else I was going to ask there now, and I've forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, it was actually you were talking there about you know, the links, and how that the links don't just end at the ports, how that they carry on into the and it's something that came across to me because I was working on it's a manuscript diary that we were lucky enough to have in the library. It's from the late 18th century, and it was written by a resident of Carrick-on-Suir, and for a man that was living in really a very small little town in the middle of nowhere, you would think, on a small island on the edge of Europe. He was incredibly well informed, not just with what was happening in Ireland, but he was able to tell us all about, through the course of his diary, what was going on with the French Revolution and what was happening in America and what was happening in the rest of Europe. So I think we kind of forget that sometimes, that there was that very strong link, and that people were very aware as well of the fact that they were linked because of the ports and because of the post and because of and the canals too. I think we sometimes forget maybe a bit about the canals.
That's exactly right, and the sort of delicate lines of interconnection between all of these places, and news and information and books and goods all passing along. Yeah,
everything did come on. Yeah. I loved that image you had too of Clontarf fishing village, and I think that probably demonstrates just how important the ports were, or the idea of port travel and the sea was to the development of places. Because when we look at Clontarf now, of course, it is one of the places in Dublin in which to live. But of course, there it's just a tiny little fishing village. Have either of you come across anything like that just shows that if it wasn't for the sea, or it wasn't for those links, that the bigger towns that we know now would still be little fishing villages, or would have disappeared?
Yeah, there's a terrific site on the British Library site. I don't know if you've seen it, Blahin, called Picturing Places. And they have a lot of, they're kind of retelling, they're using a lot of the topographical connections in the British Library, the so-called King's topographical collections. And my first image of Dublin was from there. And there is a wonderful piece there by Finola O'Kane about Dublin, about this kind of swivel east of Dublin, and particularly about the kind of the development of the big estates, the Fitzwilliam estate, for example, where everything was kind of angled for views to the sea and looking at the sea. So a whole kind of cultural shift and ideas about prosperity, and what was the whole Marian estate, for example. The idea that there could be views down to the sea from these places became part of the kind of identity of Dublin. And obviously there's examples of that in Cork as well. I couldn't find any Waterford images on the Picturing Places site. I was rather hoping there might be, and I suspect there might be some in the collection itself in the British Library, but it's a while since I've been there, so.
I guess an obvious addition to that is Pembroke Dock, which did not exist a couple of hundred years ago. It was a tiny little hamlet, barely anything. Pembroke, the town, is it's a medieval market town, been around for centuries. You know, Pembroke Dock is a naval shipyard that only exists because the Royal Navy needed a place to build ships. Built a lot of ships. Doesn't build ships anymore, started building flying boats, and now they're doing this big marine power project there. So that's another thing, that ports, like, their fortunes ebb and flow. You know, Dunleary used to be a passenger port. It's not anymore, but it's still got a port history. You know, that it's not just about places coming from a tiny little village to a port. It's also about the sort of shifts of the global economy and supply chains and politics, as we've learned recently with the Irish Sea and Brexit, constantly shifting, like these renewals and changes, and, you know, so yeah, it's constantly ebbing and flowing in size, the sort of like nodes of the Irish Sea shifting in length, and then of course, if you're talking infrastructure, the amount of time it takes to go anywhere is constantly changing as well. So a place means it's something entirely different when it's at the end of a railway line or a bypass. You know, like is it the new Ross bypass? You know, there was a lot of talk of that when we were in Ross there. You know, big change. If you build a road, build a train line, suddenly the space is completely different to an port.
Actually, when it dates our project, when we start our first and now last trip to Wales because of COVID was the week that the new Ross bypass opened. So we went to the ferry port through New Ross, and we came back on the bypass. So.
Brilliant. And it is, and it again, it does show that there are constant changes. I just have a question in here. Do you have any examples of cultural or other kinds of tourism that have worked well for port communities?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, that's really, that's the higher level ambition of our project, is to try and sort of not just tell these stories, but mobilize them in order to interest people more in stopping and spending in some of the places that we're looking at, especially because ports have a special challenge. You know, people tend to drive through them, not stop and look around. Do we have good examples of where it's working? I mean, in all of the places we're looking at, there have already been some good local successful projects. Dublin really stands out because Dublin Port have a full-time heritage officer, Lara Joy, who is working very actively both with local communities, with the Dublin Port Company, and with architectural plans to redevelop the site. So there's going to be a greenway around Dublin Port and new forms of access, a new museum and so on. So that's probably the kind of thing that everybody would like to emulate.
And I just see that, James, that you put up that a great historical example would be the relationship between Cunard and Fishguard.
That's a good example, yeah.
Could you expand on that? Because I'm sorry, maybe I'm being very, very remiss here, but I don't actually know what that relationship is.
Well, I guess there was this point. So it talks. The author Chris Williams of this story that I linked to calls it the transatlantic moment of Fishguard, where Fishguard suddenly becomes this sort of scrappy little underdog, like bringing these cruise ships from to stop at the, and there's like amazing archival photographs from the Fishguard Bay Hotel. That was a big fancy hotel that was built for all of these cruise passengers, of photographs of I think it was the Mauritania, visiting. We have a few stories in the collection about it, that these big prestigious Cunard steamers used to stop in Fishguard, which is a tiny, it was Fishguard and Goodwick, although it's long been some kind of port, it's a small place. And there was a lot of stuff in the media at the time, which you can read about in that story, about it sort of upstaging other ports in order to win all of, upstaging Liverpool and stealing all of its shipping, so that was an example that kind of made modern Fishguard. I mean, I don't think Fishguard or Goodwick could be what they are now if it hasn't been for, I think that's what led to this ongoing relation. It was hard. The last 100 years of its history was defined by that, tourism-wise.
One of the other, I think, stories that you mentioned and has kind of resonated with me was the attacks by U-boats. Have you got many stories on those from people? And is there, again, is there a running theme with those?
I think the theme is interesting because it's not just about, it's about matched sets of commemoration across the Irish Sea. So, Holyhead has a memorial to the sinking of the Leinster. There's some acknowledgement of it in Dublin, in Dunleary, but actually there's a community group who want a proper memorial on the Irish side. But there are these kind of different types of media coverage, different memorializations, different imaginations of the First World War. And I think my colleague Rita, who's the expert on this, would like us to say it wasn't just the First World War, it was the Second World War as well. Like it was, that it really was. And I think that's true of shipping losses due to weather, shipwrecks, that there's this kind of shared commemoration, and often it sort of joins communities together. So there's a really interesting story I'll end on about a guy called Alfred Centennial Johnson, who was this Massachusetts fisherman from Gloucester, Massachusetts, who had a little dory called Centennial. And I think it was some kind of bet or something. He would sail across the Atlantic in this dory, and he ended up in his Abercastle in Pembrokeshire. And there's like he's famous in Massachusetts, and there's stuff about him in the museum there. But then he's also famous at a very local level in Fishguard and in the region. There's all these kind of matching sets of commemorations, not just of tragedy and of loss of life, but also of strange and improbable events, one-offs, and sort of like little firsts, like the first flight across the Irish Sea, the first balloon journey across the Irish Sea, all that kind of thing. The steamships, the mail ships, as Claire said.
The balloons are great.
Yeah, because the first balloon was it Dunleary or somewhere over to, I've forgotten now where, because I remember.
We have a story about it, actually. I don't remember the exact.
Yeah, because I do remember seeing it, and I've forgotten what it was, but I thought that was fascinating. But
Yeah.
I think it also shows the ingenuity and almost the lack of fear that people had in those days too. They were willing to take on anything. Well, I think we're kind of coming towards the end now. Unless anybody wants to jump in and make any last minute questions, I think I could just wrap up by thanking once again Dr. James Smith and Professor Claire Connolly for 2 wonderful talks and for a lovely informative chat afterwards. Thank you once again. We've put into the chat all the links for anything that anybody, if they want to follow up on anything, and if anybody's any stories or they want to have a look at your website and have a look at what's up there already, they should be able to find them. But if they have any queries, you can always come on to me in the library, and we can send them on to you again. So once again, thank you very, very much, James and Claire, and we hope you had as an enjoyable time as I did.
Yeah, no, thank you for hosting us. We really enjoyed ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Bláithín. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye now.